What if everything came with a free Star Wars audiobook from Audible, like at the Cantina?
I'll take a half-cap spotchka, light whip.
Here's your free audiobook download for Master and Apprentice from Audible.
Or getting your pod racer serviced.
My pod racer needs upgrades to the coupling and stabilizer.
And here's your free audiobook download for Resistance Reborn from Audible.
Life in the galaxy doesn't work that way, but there is one place you can go where you can get a free Star Wars audiobook from Audible. And that's Youtini.com/audible. Click the Audible logo and start your 30-day free trial, which includes a free audiobook download. So visit Youtini.com/audible and get your free Star Wars audiobook download today.
This is George Mann, author of Myths and Fables and Dark Legends, and you're listening to The Living Force.
Welcome to the Living Force Podcast.
The Force is with you, young Skywalker. But you are not a Jedi yet.
A Youtini production.
Darkness rises and light to meet it.
Episode 67, interview with Star Wars author George Mann.
I have been expecting you.
On this episode, the Youtini team talks with George Mann, author of the new Star Wars novel Dark Legends.
Impressive.
And now, here are your hosts, Eric Eilerson and Dr. Charles Henkel.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of The Living Force. I am one of your hosts, Eric Eilerson. I am so pleased to be joined on a rather sunny afternoon in my world by Dr. Charles Henkel. Hey, buddy.
Hello there.
Happy to have you. And we have officially fired Dr. Corey Helton from the show, and we have replaced him with renowned author of Star Wars Myths and Fables, and as of today, hopefully based on the edit, Star Wars Dark Legends, George Mann. Hello.
Hey, good to see you guys.
Oh, so happy to have you back on the show. We were lucky enough to talk to George last year when Myths and Fables came out and blew us all away. And when we heard Dark Legends was coming out, we couldn't wait to have you back. So we are so stoked to talk to you about this new, really fun, cool collection of unique Star Wars stories. I mean, this is quick, I feel.
So, you mean quick after the last one?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the thing is, we didn't really stop. We just had so much fun doing the first book that there's the special edition coming out as well, and I think the cover went round on Twitter last night as well.
Yeah.
The Lucasfilm panel for San Diego Comic-Con at Home went out, and that's got 6 extra stories in it. So we kind of went main book, 6 extra stories, and then we kind of just went, let's just keep going and do what we kind of talked about originally as a Halloween type book, which is what turned into Dark Legends.
Which is absolutely fantastic. I mean, I know that, again, barring the larger issues of the world right now, we would all love to be at Galaxy's Edge picking up those extra 6 stories, but at some point, we'll get around to there. I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Now, speaking of the last year as a whole, a lot has happened since Myths and Fables dropped, both in the world, in Star Wars world, Star Wars publishing. I mean, it's hard to imagine that was only a year ago. I want to ask, start, how has your personal career changed since becoming part of Star Wars?
Ooh, good question. I mean, I'm very happy to say things have been on a kind of what feels like an upward trajectory for me, writing-wise. I mean, Myths and Fables was my first, obviously, Star Wars gig, and going straight into Dark Legends felt like, I must have done something right if the guys, which was the best, bit of validation, I suppose. And I have to say, the Star Wars community has been so welcoming and so kind about the book, and thankfully people seem to have enjoyed it. So it's that's been a real boost. And yeah, I mean, I've carried on doing my own writing as well. So I've got kind of some my original novels. I've got some original comic series. Actually, a couple of TV shows based on some of my books are in the works at the moment as well, which is really exciting. So yeah, although, obviously everything that's happened in the last few months with COVID has been a setback for everyone.
Sure, yeah.
And, I'm not immune to that, obviously, as well. I mean, I'm lucky. I'm a writer. I work from home most of the time, so
Right.
it's not been a big system shock in that sense. But comic stores were shut, so comic publishers were shutting and or putting projects on hiatus because they had no outlet for them. Barnes and Noble weren't open, so there wasn't a lot of book publishing going on. And at one point, I wasn't even sure if like Dark Legends would make it out on time because we didn't know what the landscape was going to be like.
Right.
Whether there were going to be bookshops open to receive it and sell it. But thankfully, we've got to a place where publishing's kind of starting back up again now. So
yeah.
So it's been a up and down year, really, I think.
Yeah, and it's been wild to watch that from our point of view too. I mean, like you mentioned, the book publishers, like the Shadowfall Barnes and Noble edition didn't get released because they didn't know if it was going to be open. The comics, like you were saying, because you're obviously also a comic writer, like the whole industry has just kind of now finally restarted. Obviously, all the High Republic stuff being pushed to January has been wild, but we are definitely glad that Dark Legends is going to brighten up and spookify July a little bit. I think we definitely all need it.
Yeah.
Definitely. And kind of speaking of the spookifying, so Myths and Fables and Dark Legends, they are a similar format in that they're these short stories, but the stories themselves are really, really different as far as the tone goes. So how different was it, writing these stories as opposed to your first go around with Myths and Fables?
Good question. I guess it was a similar process, but we were calling on different kind of inspirations. So, like Mike Siglain, who's the creative director at Lucasfilm Publishing, he's a huge horror fan, and we share kind of enthusiasm for like Universal horror, for Hammer horror, classic ghost stories. So we had a lot of the same touch points. So we kind of, when we went into this, one of the things that sparked it was, apart from our kind of love of horror, is the fact that when I first pitched Myths and Fables, I can't remember whether I kind of mentioned this before, but I kind of pitched more stories than we could use. We kind of threw loads of ideas out there, and some of those ideas were things that we really liked, but weren't, we wanted a spread of different types of stories in Myths and Fables. So that, you've got a little bit of spookiness with The Witch and the Wookiee, and Gaze of Stone is a bit of a darker story. But
a bit,
but those kind of two stories kind of set the tone for this, because we had a few other ideas along those lines, and then kind of I got talking to Mike about it, and we said, well, we've got to hit some of the archetypes, so we want a kind of story that feels a bit Jekyll and Hyde, and we want a story that's a bit kind of vampire-y, a werewolf type story. But I thought, well, I don't want to just hit those notes. I want to take them and Star Warsify them and put a twist on them, something a bit different. So we went through the same process again. So I kind of took a couple of ideas I'd had before and reshaped them, added a load of new ones, went in with a whole bunch more, and we cherry picked from those again. But tone-wise, what was really interesting is kind of I think I aimed for the same tone as I had with Myths and Fables with the first kind of drafts of the stories, and Mike kept coming back to me going, make them a bit darker. Go on, you can go further. I'm going like, but these have to be suitable for kids as well as adults. And he's like, just push it. It's okay.
It sounds like a Sith Lord in your ear. Like,
it was over my shoulder. But I'm glad he did, because we did push it a bit further. And like again, what we talked about last time, you go back to like Grimm's fairy tales, and those stories are dark and really quite kind of scary sometimes. So we kind of didn't feel we were going beyond that, if you see what I mean. We were kind of being true to the kind of folklorish origins of and the ghost story origins of the type of stories we want to tell. And because they've got like a moral centre to them as well, they're like, bad things happen to bad people, but it's not, you don't really have good guys getting hurt unnecessarily in the stories, if you see what I mean. So there's kind of a moral there as well that's like, well, I suppose for readers reading it, it's a lesson in kind of don't behave like this, otherwise these things will happen to you. But if you behave well, they probably won't. So it's you can save yourself from that scariness by being well behaved.
Which is fun, because I remember you said in the first book you really liked the idea that adults and kids could read these, but also these could be the stories that the kids in universe would hear, and that would teach them. And I think Dark Legends definitely does that as well. again, as being fortunate enough to have read them, they definitely have that idea of putting a kid to bed that's maybe had a temper tantrum that day and said, all right, before you go to sleep, just something to remember.
Yeah.
And I really did enjoy that.
And I think, things like stories like, I'm sure we're probably going to get onto some of the stories, but stories like The Orphanage, which I kind of very purposefully wanted to tell from a child's point of view, partly because I didn't want to tell the story from the point of view of the Grand Inquisitor, because I wanted to kind of make him the monster of the piece, but also from the point of the kind of Jedi survivor in that story as well, because then you've got a very specific perspective when you're writing from those sorts of characters, whereas putting it in the child's point of view, there's kind of a naivety to it. So you get to experience it from that point of view, and actually I think that's probably the one story in the book that has kind of a vaguely happy ending.
Yeah, we can call it that. Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
I think you actually brought up The Orphanage the last time that you were on the show with us, in particular, to kind of give us an idea of the flavor and the tone of this project, and that was the promotional image that was first released at New York Comic-Con, if I'm not mistaken, was the Grand Inquisitor in that kind of vein of Nosferatu, that image. And you just mentioned a few minutes ago that you're a big fan of the old like Hammer films and those horror stories. Is there any particular connection you have with those stories, or is there one that like is your go-to, like that you have just always loved above the others?
Ooh, that's a good question. There's a couple, really, I think. Not necessarily Hammer, but kind of old school horror. Actually, particularly the British school as well. I don't know how well you guys know this stuff over there, but obviously you know Christopher Lee and
right,
Cushing and kind of and their friendship and professional capacity. But there's a particular film called Night of the Demon, which I absolutely adore. I think it's called Curse of the Demon in the States. I don't know if you've seen it. It's Dana Andrews, and it's from the 50s. It's like a black and white movie, and it's based on M.R. James' Cast in the Runes is the short story it's based on, and it's phenomenal just because the level of tension that goes through it. You hardly ever see the monster in it. There is a demon creature in it. It's essentially this. I mean, it's a spoiler, but it's like a 70-year-old movie. So,
yeah, we'll allow it.
Yeah. The embargo is up.
Essentially, kind of the story is about like a black magic pagan curse. Essentially, it's all very subtly done. Like an American reporter comes in, who is a debunker. His job is to debunk people who claim to have kind of black magic or occult powers. And he goes up against this guy, Carswell, who has this he gives him a slip of paper with some runes on it, basically, which once it's been given, the only way you can get rid of it is to give it back to the person who gave it to you. And otherwise this demon is going to come for you. So the whole film is about him basically unraveling because he knows this thing's coming for him and he's trying desperately to trick the guy to have the thing back. So while we didn't reference that story particularly in the book, what I did want to do is get that sense of tension in some of the stories, that kind of things are going wrong, and actually in some instances, as the viewer or the reader in this case, more than the characters, and know that the danger's there, and one of the things about this kind of horror story is that idea of watching someone fall by degrees. They make a bad decision, and they, at first they could kind of walk back from that, but then they try to put it right by making a worse decision, and it becomes this kind of trap that they fall into. And as the reader or the viewer, you're kind of going, no, don't do it. Oh, you've done it. And that's kind of how I kind of see the path to the dark side. That it's it's the road of good intentions. That you're constantly trying to make these decisions, and they feel like small decisions at first. I could just, if I use that little bit of dark side power just to defeat my enemy, who's the real villain here. Yeah. Then actually, I've just used a bit of their own power against them, and it just opens that chink, and then suddenly it becomes. I mean, we've seen it time and time again in Star Wars. It's that that road. So I wanted to kind of get some of that in there as well, and that's something that comes out of those films. And there is another specific example. There's a classic kind of monkey's paw. I can't remember which one it is. Film with Peter Cushing as a shopkeeper, a curio shopkeeper, and basically the things that people come in and buy are cursed objects, and you then get their story. And that's kind of what I wanted to do with the Doc Ondar story here, and kind of that idea of the curator who's a bit knowing and lets people damn themselves in the way we've just described.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, I'm looking at the beginning, and it reminds me, like, Buyer Beware, Gilded Cage are definitely stories in Dark Legends that are kind of everything you're just saying. And I wanted to ask about those kinds of stories. It seems that Dark Legends is full of stories that are very much about the villains, quote unquote, kind of creating their own demise, like you're saying. Like, they'll make a choice and they'll go further, and it's kind of like we are the ones that make our own horror. Like, there are some monster tales for sure, but as opposed to Myths and Fables seem to be a little more about some external forces, like the Vader story being the boogeyman and things, whereas Dark Legends is more of we make our own prisons and things like that. Was that something that was very important to you from the start of writing, or is that also a direction where Michael was like, hey, you can make it darker by just having this guy destroy himself?
No, I don't think we ever talked about that. I think it was that's something that I kind of brought to it, because I from my point of view, I always think, no one is an out. I mean, yes, in fiction there are out and out villains, but even someone like Vader isn't an out and out villain. As proved by what happens at the end. When he redeems himself.
Also a spoiler from an old movie. Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, exactly. But I think so. Shades of Grey, and yes, there are monsters. There are monster stories, of course. But actually, yeah, I think most villains fall into that trap themselves, or they make themselves into who they are. And actually, that is a theme that keeps coming back in these stories, isn't it? It's in the Exegol story as well. It's that idea of I'm leading myself down this path because I'm so fixated on achieving this that I'll do whatever's necessary.
Yeah. Oh man, I am holding my mouth shut about that Exegol story. For all you reading it, yeah, it is definitely, again, one of those cases like you're saying, where as the reader, you put these beautiful breadcrumbs in that we can see. Wait, is this? And then you can't stop the character from going down that path, and it is that one of those wrenching nightmare stories for sure.
Yeah, and what the interesting kind of, I think probably the story that is the most kind of opposite to all of that really is the Vader story, Predecessor.
Mm-hmm.
In that, I think my starting point with that one was to go. In the movies, we see Vader kind of like force choking people left, right, and center. Imperial Officer B says something, gets choked. Someone else steps up to the plate, takes his place. Yes, Lord Vader, I'll sort it all out.
Right.
And I've always come away thinking those people must live in abject fear, like absolute terror, because if they say the wrong thing, they're going to get choked to death. What is the impact of Vader when he's not there? These actions that seem quite flippant. He does it and then he marches off, and we never address it. We never go back to it. And I was kind of trying to work through what is the psychological impact that has on those other people who work on that Star Destroyer, and how they feel about it, which is kind of where Predecessor came from, that idea of this guy who, again, I guess it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in the story, but it's kind of not his fault. He's unraveling because of what's been going on around him, and ends up kind of, well, he's on the cover of the book. He ends up getting choked by Vader,
Right.
But and again, the path is very similar in the sense of, like, if he could have stopped that happening, but this time it was more an outside influence affecting his judgment and his, on what's going on in his head. So kind of slightly different approach.
Yeah, sure. Definitely.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm so excited about this project, just overall. But George, we have a friend in common,
right.
Mr. Kevin Scott, who is a friend of the show. One of our favorite writers that we've talked to as well. Y'all appear to have like a really wonderful friendship that has blossomed recently that we've been able to see from the outside into a whole bunch of different creative adventures, but including y'all's live streams about, the writing process, promoting each other's work on social media. What's it like getting to navigate the Star Wars publishing world with such a good friend who's also involved?
It's great. So Cav and I have been friends since like 2010, I think. So good 10 years, and we're friends first and foremost before we're colleagues. Brothers from another mother and all that.
Awesome.
But yeah, I mean, so we're very close friends, and we kind of decided we wanted to do some work projects together. So we kind of tentatively tested the water to see how we get on writing together and working together. And I don't know how much you know about our background, but we've both done quite a lot of Doctor Who writing in our time as well.
Right.
And we did a few Doctor Who projects together. They were our kind of first projects, some comics and some radio plays. I had a real hoot doing them as well. And then it was Cav who first got a Star Wars gig with Wild Space.
Right.
And went off and obviously Cav's career with Star Wars has just gone stellar. Which is
okay. Yeah.
It's been brilliant to see, and it was actually, it was because of Cav's relationship with Star Wars that I got to meet Mike Siglain, actually just socially at San Diego Comic-Con, because we were all having drinks together.
Wow.
And at no point was I kind of like pushing on him, I want to write Star Wars. Inside I was going, I want to write Star Wars. But actually we bonded over the horror movies and geek culture and a mutual love of kind of lots of touchstones, including Star Wars. But at no point did I turn around and go, I want to write Star Wars, Mike. But I think I might have mentioned last time we talked, what happened after that is we kind of followed each other on social media, and I released a kind of a spooky novel, kind of Witchwood, which is a supernatural crime novel. And Mike bought it and read it. And then I saw him again at New York Comic Con, just socially. And he took me to one side and went, right, I've read Witchwood. Do you want to write some Star Wars? And do you want to do that with Star Wars? So even at that point, we were kind of talking about the spooky stuff, really, as much as anything else.
Sure.
So Cav was absolutely fundamental to my introduction to kind of writing Star Wars professionally. And we'd love to do some Star Wars together as well. That's something we keep talking about, and I'm sure will happen at some point. We've just done a Sherlock Holmes book, radio play for Audible, Voice of Treason, which was the longest thing we've done together. It was kind of a 10-hour drama, and that was huge fun because we kind of just got each other on Skype, and when we were sitting writing, he was writing one chapter, I was writing the next, and then we'd switch and rewrite each other.
Oh
wow, that's awesome.
We got to a point where we just trust each other so much that there's no kind of ego in it. We'll just overwrite each other to make it better, and it becomes a stronger thing because we've both had an input to it, and it's got both of our voices in it. So yeah, it's great. It's he's a mate and a colleague.
Man, well, I mean, given that we just got the release of another Star Wars audio drama in Afro last week, and there seems to be a brand new time period that everyone wants to explore next year. I don't know. Maybe we need you guys to write a High Republic audio drama from our mouths to Del Rey's ears.
That would be amazing.
Brilliant. But taking a quick detour from Star Wars for a second, you have, like you've been saying, continuing to work on a bunch of other projects this year. Like you just had Engine Word #1 just came out. You're writing comics. You're writing all kinds of other stuff. Everyone go pick that up, by the way. Does it feel different at all now working on your other projects now than it did before you were also a Star Wars writer? Like, is there a thing like in the back of your head saying, I'm doing this, oh man, I'm also writing Star Wars now? Like, are you able to like segment them?
I think you have to segment them because otherwise you drive yourself mad. And I think you have to be able to get yourself into the frame of mind to go, I need to live in the project I'm writing and give it my all. But there's definitely, like Engine Ward is a prime example. It's kind of a science fiction story. It doesn't really bear any relation to Star Wars, but there's definitely been people who've been checking it out because they've read Myths and Fables. They've seen the work I've done in Star Wars. They've seen I've got a kind of a science fantasy comic, and they're interested to find out more about it. So it's definitely helped that way as well. And I think the other thing is kind of, I'll always make time for Star Wars, because it's Star Wars. So
right.
I'm very keen to kind of say to the guys at Lucasfilm, like, I'm planning my next 6 months. I'm going to write this book for myself. Have you got me in mind for anything? Because if you have, I'm going to make sure I book out that time so that I don't fill it with something else.
Wow, yeah. I guess I never, in the freelance and the writing world, I never realized that is how schedules have to be made, though. That's totally right.
Yeah, I mean, you're lucky if you can see 6 months into the future as a full-time freelance writer, because, that projects roll like that. But, I'm never going to turn down a Star Wars project, even if I'm writing something else and Mike calls me up and says, do you want to do this Star Wars project? Yes, I will, Mike. And then I'll panic and figure out how to make it work. But,
sure.
But yeah, I mean, to have an ongoing dialogue and build a relationship with those guys is perfect. And they're wonderful people to work with at Lucasfilm. So building that relationship, so there's a gig there. If I know if there's something coming, I can plan around it. Is the perfect situation, because then I can make sure I can do the stuff that I want to do and say that I can't do within the Star Wars universe, and then make sure that I kind of save that time to do something Star Wars as well. That's what I hope to do.
Brilliant.
Yeah, the best of both worlds is what that sounds like.
It does. I do feel very, very lucky to be in that situation at the moment where, I've got a Star Wars book out and I've just had my own creator-owned comic come out, and it's kind of like, it's taken 20 years to get here, but at the same time, we're very lucky to be here.
Right.
For sure.
Well, we feel lucky to have you as part of the Star Wars universe as well. Getting back to Dark Legends a little bit, we talked about how these stories had kind of a darker twist, but are there any tales that you wrote for this project in particular that you kind of surprised yourself with either how dark they got or a turn that a character took or anything like that?
Oh, let me think. I think, the Orphanage, I know we've talked about it a lot already, but that was the story that kind of surprised me, in the sense that it was the story that unlocked the whole book. Because, at the point where I was trying to generate ideas for what these stories could be like, and when you've got a blank canvas, it can be a bit daunting. I'm sure you guys must feel about any new project, where you look at it and you go, well, all the possibilities are there. So what am I going to do? And I was starting to kind of throw ideas down, and we were bouncing this back and forth, and we'd said, let's do something that's a bit Jekyll and Hyde, which obviously we did in what's the story called, The Dark Mirror. But it was when I had that idea. Basically, I was watching Rebels again, as you do, and and the Grand Inquisitor appeared on the screen, and with his sharp teeth and that gaunt face, and I just thought, vampire. And then it just clicked, and I just went, oh, he's Nosferatu. So I immediately emailed Mike and just went, and the email just said, Grand Inquisitor as Nosferatu, and he just wrote back in capitals, you have to do this now. So like, right. It was amazing. Yes. So that was the first thing. So then I kind of went straight into it, and that unlocked it, because I kind of went, right, this is setting the tone for the whole thing. And at that point, I was a bit worried, because Star Wars kind of skirts around that whole idea, and obviously you do see it with Anakin when he's turning into Darth Vader, of kind of the Force-sensitive children and what happens to them and all of that. And I was kind of thinking, well, this is quite dark. I'm going down a pretty bleak path here with the Grand Inquisitor stealing children from an orphanage.
A little dark.
A little dark, yeah. But finding the way in to write that, which again, I was doing it from the child's point of view, and I wrote that. I kind of wrote the outline, and then I wrote that story, and Grant did the piece of art, and we were kind of like, right, that's what the book's going to be like. And then, I think the Exegol story was darker than I'd imagined as well. All of them, really. I mean, there's not much. There's not much
go there.
Our working title for the book was Siths and Legends. Joking
forever.
title.
I tell you what, I wish it was like in comics, where you get a second printing cover, and there'd be a second printing of Dark Legends, limited run, Siths and Legends. That would be.
So I knew all these stories were going to be, leaning into that, into what makes the Sith tick, what and trying to look at the different aspects of the dark side. You've got the Night Sisters, of course, as well. And then just characters like the guy who has the mask in Buyer Beware, who is seduced by the darkness.
Right.
But yeah, I really did have to kind of get myself into the almost like a switch in my head to go, right, now I need to write dark, bleak stuff, but also do it in a way that's accessible, and that isn't going to be too scary. It was quite a hard balance.
Definitely.
Yeah, it ain't called Light Legends.
So we discussed last time there are some pretty brutal myths, like you're saying, that are meant for children. Like you mentioned Hansel and Gretel, you're talking about Grimm and all these things, and there still is a really good moral to this story. Now, we've discussed a bit about the history of all these horror movies and things like that. What do you personally think this element of darkness helps accomplish to tell these stories? Like maybe better than something that's a little lighter. Like you can learn morals from a light story, but there's something about the dark ones that just seem to stick in our memory from childhood, and you never forget those, I guess, teachings. Why do you think that is?
I think it's a difficult one to answer, actually, but and you're absolutely right. I think it's shock value as much as anything. It's almost like a nice twee story, like you say. You can learn something from it. You can get a nice smiling moral at the end of it. But you read something that's truly scary or truly shocks you, it stays with you. It leaves an impression on you. And I think that's where it really sticks. That idea of, actually, I dreamt about that, or I had a bit of a sleepless night because I read this thing and it just kept turning over my mind. And, and that's where I think, actually, especially when you're writing something that is intended to be a kind of all ages project, there's a moral responsibility on me as the writer to make sure that that path that we talked about, that the incorrect path that the person took, is visible, so that the person who's reading it, especially if they're younger, can read that story and go, wow, something horrible happened to that person, but I understand it was their fault and they did it to themselves. And I think I've never been a fan. I'm a big fan of horror, but I've never been a fan of kind of gore stories, that are slasher picks, or, they have their place, of course they do, but they're about sensationalism. And they don't have that kind of moral core. Don't often have that moral core to them. Sometimes they do, of course. And I think that's the type of horror that I wanted to write, that had something to say. It wasn't just shock value. It was using the shock to make the point. And I think that's what those stories do. It's that kind of, like you say, back to Hansel and Gretel, on that thing of like, my God, there are people out there who want to cook us in an oven, but they end up getting cooked in the oven themselves because of that. It's that, horrible things happen to horrible people.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's it's about that shock.
Yeah, and it also, the way you talk about it, you also treat your audience, whether adult or child, with a lot of respect in these stories, I think, too, because, children are way more intelligent and able to grasp onto concepts, and I think a lot of authors give them credit for. Yeah,
I absolutely agree with that. I think, I was a child who read a lot, and I read a lot of adult novels as a child. And I was very lucky to have them in the house and be exposed to them. And I've always believed that you don't write down to children; you just write for children. So there are obviously themes you don't want to put in a children's book that would belong in a young adult novel or an adult novel, but not in a children's book. High sex contents, drugs, things like that. You want to be avoiding those topics because they're not going to be suitable. But that aside, I don't think. I've never tried to simplify my language or, paint a picture in simple colours. It's actually, children understand complexity. And actually, if there is the odd word in there that they don't know and they have to look it up and they learn that word, that's got to be a good thing.
That's how I learned words when I was young. That's what you do. That's how I learn words now, frankly.
Yeah, exactly. There's a writer, probably typically I haven't got one on my shelf, but in the UK, when we were kids, we had these Doctor Who books called Target. And they were basically, this was in the days, because I'm old, these are in the days before home videos were a big deal. So a lot of the old Doctor Who episodes had been trashed or just weren't commercially available. So you could watch the new Doctor stories that were on the telly, but you couldn't see past Doctor stories. And the only way you could get them was to read the novelizations. And the guy particularly who wrote a lot of these, called Terrance Dicks, died recently. And there's a whole generation of British writers who grew up reading Terrance Dicks books, and he basically gave us a lexicon. So we learned words like capacious. That's the one, the Doctor had capacious pockets. And every time I'm reading a book and the word capacious comes up, I always know that person read Terrance Dicks as a kid. It's like a little,
Wow.
And Cav's the same. He grew up with these books. And I think that was, there were lessons to be learned for me from those books, because Terrance Dicks never talked down to his audience. And he used complex words, and he told complex stories in a really clever way that was still accessible. And if I can get anywhere close to half of what he managed to achieve, then I feel like I'm doing the right thing.
Amazing.
And I mean, we're all here for a similar reason. I mean, George Lucas with the entire Star Wars story that he had a hand in, like, yes, there are very simple ideas that he put forward, but they are presented in a very complex fashion. And we were all children, I'm assuming, when we first encountered these stories. And look where we are now. And we're using the morals and the lessons that we took from those stories to even inform our decisions today. So there really is a power in this kind of storytelling, whether it be A New Hope or whether it be Dark Legends.
Absolutely. No, I mean, that's the kind of thing that's gave me sustenance, actually, while working on all of these stories, is that thing that Star Wars is a myth. It was always intended to be a myth. The way George Lucas set out to create the Star Wars universe, he was telling a myth in the kind of classic tradition, and everything's heightened, and and there are core moral lessons in those films, and all of the spin-off media that came afterwards that, like you say, have stayed with us all. So you kind of, with these books, I don't mean this to sound highfalutin, it's that, at the end of the day, they're just storybooks, but you want to continue that tradition. It's Star Wars means such a lot to me, that to feel like I can then add back to it and contribute back to it and continue the tradition that George Lucas started is quite a big deal. It feels like a big responsibility. So, I try and spend a lot of time thinking about that as I approach the stories, to make sure that I'm doing justice to it.
Oh, of course. And I believe the last time that we spoke to you, you actually told us that one of your favorite things to contribute is brand new characters, like creating these brand new characters and introducing them into the universe that we know. Our favorites, I think I can say, Eric, still being Darth Calduth, and we're still working on getting you that action figure if we can ever find that. But who was your favorite creation from this time around?
It sounds like a cheat to say, but it's still Darth Calduth. I mean, I had to bring him back.
Don't cheat at all. Yes, it's so good.
And the guys at Lucasfilm were cool with it, because at first I said straight away, apart from the fact that was the story that seemed to chime with more readers than any other, the one that more people talked about than any other, it was also the one where I felt, what we've got here is a character whose story deserves to be told more. And it just seemed like an obvious thing. If we're going to do a book with loads of stories about Sith in them, I've just got to bring Darth Calduth back and tell more of his story. And that's, so Gilded Cage was there from the start. And also, obviously, I wanted to do something with the Night Sisters, and the two things just came together. And I tried, with that story, I tried to inject so much into it. I mean, actually, the first draft of it was twice as long as it should have been. I mean, it's probably still the longest story in the book, but I had to trim it out, because I was like, and then Darth Calduth went and did this, and then he did this. And I can't. And they were like, it can be long, but it can't be twice the length of any other story. So I was like, yeah, fair point.
Yeah. So yet, we'll say that. Like, I'm about those notes are still in a doc somewhere.
Somewhere.
There's a saved project on George's computer that says "Secret Future Darth Caldoth Novel." We're here for it.
I want to write that book so badly, but yeah, I think being able to create a new Jedi character. I mean, obviously, I don't want to give spoilers, but things happen. Sure. But kind of what I was trying to do with that Jedi character was like, if Conan was a Jedi, he's like,
oh yeah,
he's not Conan, but he's got a name that's like a kind of, it's not like a normal Jedi name. It's more kind of and he's quite a brutal fighting machine. And I was like, yeah, that's what I want to do. Create new characters like that.
Right.
So yeah, but I mean, what amazed me about the book overall is the again, just like Myths and Fables, perhaps even more so here, that the creativity that the guys allowed me to inject into the stories, like the amount of like new characters and things that, like you said, in the Orphanage you've got a Jedi survivor. In the Dark Mirror you've got new Jedi characters. There's new Sith characters in The Life Immortal. It's crazy, really. I still can't believe they let me get away with it.
Well, and on that same token, I mean, some of the characters you're making are expanding themselves. I mean, Caldoth got a mention in Cavan's Dooku Jedi Lost. I mean, he's expanding out, and you've also then gotten to take known entities like the Night Sisters and Doc Ondar, like you mentioned earlier. Like this character who is now also in a theme park, you've decided this is something that he did in his life, and that's great.
Oh,
that is in stone now. So like, what is that like, kind of to mirror the new characters, to realize that these large storied characters now have events in their lives placed there by you?
Yeah, it's mad. It's mad. Like, again, talked about responsibility, but there's a huge sense of responsibility when you approach a character that, I mean, there's a Vader story in it. I got to write Vader again. But and then you're right, like Doc Ondar. Well, the amount of work, I've seen the work that the Imagineers put into creating Batu. Because I've been lucky enough to kind of see a lot of their documents, and they poured hours and hours and hours, between them, thousands of man-hours into creating the background for Batu. So to have that and then go, right, and I'm now going to tell a new story with that character that you've spent all this time creating, is there's a certain weight to it that you have to kind of take on board and go, right, I need to make sure this is true to what those people who created this would want it to be, and I need to feel like it needs to be additive. You can't diminish that character in any way. You can't do something that makes them feel less exciting than they already are. You have to do something that makes them more. So yeah, it's quite a thing. Luckily, something I've had experience of before with things like Doctor Who, where it kind of,
right,
you can never quite get past the first moment when you sit down and write, the TARDIS or the Doctor, and it's the same with Vader, Vader and the Star Destroyer, and and you're going, wow, okay, take a breath, walk away, make a cup of tea, come back to it, and then you almost have to put it aside, because you almost have to go, right, but my job here now is to write the story. I can't get hung up on the fact I'm writing a Vader story. I have to just write it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the way I do that is to go, right, it's just the first draft. It doesn't matter. I just got to almost like I just got to write it, and then it can go back and be corrected. And Lucasfilm Story Group can take a look at it and give me some feedback, and then I can polish it until it's right. But it doesn't have to be right the first time, because if you get into that frame of mind, you'll never write it, because you're so scared. Because again, it's a character that's loomed large in your life for however long you've been alive. Since you first able to watch it. So you can be a little scary, but it feels great afterwards to know you've contributed.
Absolutely.
Man, George, you're making me want to get back into Doctor Who. I kind of fell off a little bit after Matt Smith, but maybe I'll get back around to it.
I mean, it's baked into my psyche from childhood over here in the UK. But yeah, lucky enough to do. I wrote 2 novels. One was a Matt Smith novel, and one was a War Doctor novel, so set during the Time War with John Hurt's Doctor, which was huge fun.
What a performance that was, even in just that small amount of time.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Whew.
Beautiful. So last time we talked to you, you mentioned that your son, who actually is a massive Star Wars fan, helped you with brainstorming and developing some of the ideas for Myths and Fables. So was it similar at all this time around? And even if it wasn't, how do you think having that kind of multi-generational input helps to develop effective myths?
Ooh, you're asking some great questions. So it was exactly the same. I went through the same process of kind of, I've got a core of an idea, James, and I want to bounce it all around off you. And, a prime example of that, something he added actually, is in the Blood Moon story. I wanted to do a bleeding cliff of kyber crystal that was influencing the kind of Shistavanian character to behave like a werewolf. And James was like, yeah, but what if it was the sun? Because they've said in Star Wars that there are stars with kyber hearts. What if it was the sun that was flawed? And I was like, and there could be these like giant gouts of solar flare that are like red, and they're like it's like a giant, like Kylo Ren's hilt, but on a stellar scale. And he was like, yes, that's more cool than a bleeding cliff, Dad. I was like,
oh my god,
it is.
That is such a main part of that story too.
I know. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, well done.
No, exactly. And of course, it played. And from there, what happens is then I then take it and go, werewolves and the moon, and you go, okay, so planets affecting and so you start to lean into the myth, and you build a story with that in mind. So I mean, that's the most fundamental thing he did for this book. But with all of the stories, we go to the gym together. We'd be like sat on the exercise bikes, and I'd go, right, I want to tell a story. Like one of the ideas I pitched was an IG-88 story. I was like, IG-88 as a Terminator, so I go, right, let's work that up as a story today. And I bounce it around with him and go, I've got these ideas, and this is how, and he'd be like, yeah, that bit's great, this bit's not so good, or he'll call me up on like Star Wars knowledge, and he'll go, yeah, but in this specific episode of the Clone Wars, and I'll go, yes, thank you, you're right, so he definitely helps a lot. But in terms of the other part of your question about kind of building myths and things, he's obviously from a younger generation. So what I also do is, once I've written the stories, even if he hasn't had any input into kind of talking it through, is he's the first guy I go to, I print it out and take it to him and say, will you read it for me? And then he'll come back to me, and he's really honest with his feedback, which is really useful. And he'll say, this works, but your references here are going over my head because you're talking about 1970s horror films again. I go, right, okay, I need to be a bit more
sure, yeah,
to work for a younger generation.
Mm-hmm.
And he'll catch me on spelling mistakes and things. He's like little assistant, really.
Seriously, I'm gonna say, like, he's gonna apply to be an editor at Lucasfilm in the future, and just his application is the books. I mean, like, this
yeah,
there you go.
Absolutely. No, he's been great, because the reason I don't have to include him in these things. I can obviously, I can write stories without James, but it's actually wanting to include him because it's a father-son thing. It's he's like 16 going on 17. He spends most of his time in his room or with his friends or playing his guitar. We do a couple of things together. We go to the gym when they're open, obviously not in the current situation. We walk the dogs together, and this is something that we can do together. And, so I use it as, that's the beauty of Star Wars. It's multi-generational. And it's one of the few things, like, he's kind of feels like he's going through a phase at the moment where we used to watch all the Marvel movies together. Now he's older, we're watching the Netflix Marvel stuff together. But which has been brilliant. But he's kind of reached a point where he's like, I'm not so fussed about the Marvel movies anymore. I feel like, I want to be onto different things, but Star Wars is still there. Star Wars is still like, let's watch the new series of Clone Wars. Let's watch The Mandalorian, and for me, that's kind of something to hold on to. So this is an opportunity to bring him into what I'm doing.
Wow. I love that. I mean, as a sucker for anything father-son related, real-life fiction, it's so awesome to hear, because it is taking the fiction that we love and making it real world in a way that is very special. So I love that you guys get to do that. And on that similar note, actually, of making more of these stories and working with your son, with Missing Fables, you told us that obviously you wrote a lot more stories that didn't make it into the book, 6 of which are coming out in the Galaxy's Edge version, a lot of which made it into this version. Without getting too much speculation, anything like that, was it similar this time around? Or were there Dark Legends stories that also had to be cut that are sitting around? And on that same note, with no remote official question, is there a possibility of a 3rd edition of George Mann Star Wars stories?
So, well, to take your answers at a time. So, I think I went in with 20 story ideas for Dark Legends. Now, they're at varying degrees of development at that point. So, some of them are half page, some of them are 1.5 pages, 2 pages of kind of an outline of the story. And that's what, the process is we kind of put those stories to the editors at Lucasfilm, to Story Group. We look at them and go, well, what's going to give us the best spread? And I'm sure there's things where they go like, we can't cover that because we want to do something else with it, or we can't, we're not exploring that era at the moment, park that one, etc. So they come back to me and go, okay, we want you to develop these ones. So what I have is, well, there's still some from Myths and Fables, and there's still a load from Dark Legends, which are in that kind of embryonic stage. I would love to do more with them, but I also wouldn't rely on older ideas. I think it depends on. I mean, there may be 1 or 2 actually made it from the Myths and Fables pile into this final book, and they change quite a lot in the process. So if there's a 3rd book comes up, I'd very much want to approach that and go, right, okay, what's key to making that book a success? Have I got anything that I can take and twist and change to put into that book? There were a couple of specific stories that I really, really want to tell that I haven't had a chance to yet.
Yeah, more Darth Kaldoth, obviously.
Yeah. Goes without saying, Darth Kaldoth needs his own series of novels.
Damn straight.
Yeah, I mean, I've told them I want to do more. We'll see. I think we'll have to see how this book goes, I suppose, as well. Missing Fables seems to have done very well. I'm hoping this book's going to do very well. Obviously, the world situation is slightly different at the moment.
A bit. Yep.
I don't know how it's going to affect things. I think certainly Mike has been encouraging, if not in specifics, about more books in this series. Certainly in terms of he said, you're going to write more Star Wars. So what
a sentence to hear out loud.
So hopefully, the right projects will come up, the right situation, the right timings, and some things will happen. But I know certainly, the indication from those guys is they're happy with the stories and they like the stories. So hopefully that'll lead to more Star Wars. We'll see.
No question.
Yeah, I think we have the same hope. So to kind of wrap things up a little bit, last year when we talked to you, we ended things with talking about the legacy that you hope to have or hope to leave on Star Wars. This year, we want to ask you something a little bit different. It's a huge time for Star Wars publishing in terms of having new writers, new stories. I mean, we have the entire High Republic coming up. We just heard about the Empire Strikes Back version of From a Certain Point of View with just a ton of new people.
Yeah.
How do you think that this time in particular in Star Wars publishing is going to be remembered with all of this newness? Writers, mediums, stories, all of it.
It's a good question. I think what I'd like it to be remembered for, I think, is that Star Wars is for everyone. And what we're seeing is the publishing, in all its many forms, comics, adult novels, children's novels, is embracing diversity of voice. I think that's really important. So, the Star Wars universe is broad enough and wide enough to represent everyone. And we need those voices to be to be telling us stories in the Star Wars universe, because then they're going to bring a different perspective. They're going to bring something new. They're going to add to the overall kind of the meta story of Star Wars. So I think that's a really important step, and I'm glad to see that seems to be happening more and more. But then I think on top of that, I think it's a time of innovation as well. I think, we're in a pause between movies. The Skywalker series is finished. We don't know what's coming next. We know things are in the pipeline, but we don't know what's coming. We've got a few years. So publishing is going to be carrying the torch. Publishing and TV, obviously, which I'm really excited about what they're doing. But publishing is going to be carrying one of the torches of Star Wars. And I think, the stuff that Cav's involved in with High Republic, hugely exciting. I hope that it's going to be as successful as it should be, and that it continues for a good long time. I've obviously waved my hand and said, in the future, if I would love to contribute to that as well. I'm sure everyone else is doing that as well. But what I love about what they're doing with the High Republic is it's that whole thing that we were talking about earlier about introducing new characters and new voices and looking at things from a different perspective. And I think that's going to keep Star Wars feeling fresh and new. It's a new EU essentially.
There's no better way we could say it, honestly. That's when, our whole philosophy at Youtini and the Living Force is that the expanded universe is just that. It's something that expands, and it is expanding the fictional stories. It's expanding the base of people, like you're saying, that get to write and get to create. And the future literally couldn't be brighter. I mean, I even think back to the High Republic announcement. There was like a big YouTube video. They got millions of views for a book for books. Like, that's incredible in 2020. Yeah, absolutely marvelous. Well, we can't wait for that. We're so, I know we keep saying it, so thankful to have you writing these stories. They're really special. They're really something, and we really hope to have you back on the third of these books, or better yet, when the Darth Kaladoth trilogy is finally announced.
Or
even if, God forbid, there wasn't a future project, George, you have a standing invitation on this podcast. You're an absolute pleasure to talk to.
Likewise, guys. I always enjoy it so much. That's a real pleasure.
So glad. Well, before we let you go, tell everyone listening now, let's see, what you are able to announce that's coming up. What of your work can they pick up, and where can they find you online?
Okay, so best place to find me online is on Twitter. It's @George_Mann. Coming up, Engine Ward has just launched. You mentioned Engine Ward issue 1. It's a 12-issue run. It's tied to the Zodiac symbol. So every month there's a new issue, and it's tied to the Zodiac period that month is in. It's going to be an evolving story. Awesome. What else? Obviously, Dark Legends is out next week, Tuesday, or today, if you're watching it today. I think that's probably it that I can talk about at the moment. Lots of other things in the pipeline.
I never get tired of hearing that answer. It's one of my favorites. So we will be bringing you the news of George's work. Obviously, stay tuned for that. And once again, George, thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much.
There is no hatred. There is joy. There is no division. There is union. There is no apathy. There is passion. There is no gatekeeping. There is community. This is the Youtini Star Wars fan code. Embrace it, live by it, and above all, trust in the living force. That's all for this week. Join our community and surround yourself with like-minded fans by visiting us online at youtini.com. Until next time, may the force be with you.